So yesterday I released a video where I made the rather audacious claim to have solved the problem of free will. And in that episode, I said that, free will proponents, though, proponents of determinism, both have an accounting problem. uh, Somebody like Robert Sapolsky would challenge me to show the thing that has free will or to show the act of free will. He says somewhere that, show me the neuron that acts of its own accord, independent of the firing of all other neurons, and I'll believe in free will. I take that very seriously, and I admit that I and other proponents of free will cannot point to the thing that has free will. They can't point to the act of free will. Though determinists have the problem that they can assume that it is the conservation of momentum, moving through the particles, and that every moment is, leaned on by the moment before it in a chain that goes all the way back to the beginning of time. But they can't really go back and do the accounting step by step to show that. They just assume that that's the case. So if I'm to solve the problem of free will, I have to solve the problem of where does consciousness push against matter? And, perhaps this is a little bit of equivocation, but what I'm realizing, having gone back and listened to that episode, that I didn't fully square the circle on that one. And so, what I'd like to do right now is to take another attempt to be more precise and to walk through what I was trying to establish yesterday. So, I guess the change that I would make is that no, I can't show directly how consciousness pushes against matter to choose to select between possible outcomes. But I believe what I established yesterday proves that matter does it, right? It's a difference of how and that. And it comes down to this recurring theme when I look at consciousness, the problem of consciousness, that consciousness does things that if we were to try to achieve them in the material world mechanistically, it would take an infinite mechanism in order to do that. And so, one of the thought experiments that I've offered on this channel is something that I call Gödel's robot. And very simply, it would be that if you were to be engaging with a robot that claimed to be sentient, you could, bring it down to the question of pain. You could say to the robot, okay, you're a conscious being, you're full artificial intelligence, um, in the true sense, what it is intended, what it's supposed to be. Do you feel pain? And the robot would say, sure, yes, I feel pain. And we could, run a quick experiment on that and, forgive the coarseness of the analogy. But bam, I punch that robot in the nose and the robot goes, oh my God, I feel pain. And I'm supposed to take the action of the robot, acting as though it feels pain, saying that it feels pain, on the same level of faith that I would if I were doing that with somebody else. The, you know, broader um, thought experiment is that, you and I do that process. I punch you in the nose, you punch me in the nose. Again, forgive the coarseness of the example, but I think pain is the best qualia to focus on because it just sort of cuts through to the point, which is I can't see your pain and you can't see my pain. I can't weigh your pain and you can't weigh my pain. But we trust that each other's pain exists. And for no more reason than As human beings, we've had to evolve to understand that as I have feelings, other people have feelings. And if I run afoul of that, they'll let me know by hurting my feelings that they have pain, and I'll let them know that I have feelings by causing them pain. And even though we can't ever get to each other's subjectivity, we trust that it's there. And so if I had a robot and I was to do that, experiment and punch that robot in the nose and the robot were to act as though the robot has pain, I could ask the robot, you know, are you acting this way because of pain? And the robot could say yes. The problem that the robot has, or the um, phenomenon that the robot has, is that the robot will have some coding, will have some programming, will have some string of ones and zeros, some algorithm that is the thing that is causing them to act as though they have pain and would then itself actually be the pain. So, this problem that you and I have where we can't see or interface with each other's subjectivity, I can't see your pain, you can't see my pain, isn't true of the robot. And so we could demand of the robot, show us the coding, show us the ones and zeros that is your pain. The problem with this is where Gödel's and completeness theorems come in. And I believe this to be the deeper meaning of them, which is that you can take that strings of ones and zeros, which is the pain. This set of numbers is real, actual pain. If the robot's truly conscious and if the robot has qualia and has feelings like you and I do. The problem is that that is an objective fact. And what Gödel established was that in order to verify an objective string of numbers, an objective algorithm, you can draw a circle around that, and outside of that circle, you can come up with a Gödel sentence, which in objectivity, in formalism, in logic, proves the first set. And what I'm arguing is what that would do is that would take the authority of the pain. It would take this initial string of numbers that is the pain, and it would take that pain and it would transfer it to the second group of numbers. But this second group of numbers is just like the first group of numbers, only more complex, which means that the first group of numbers can't stand as the authority for the second group of numbers. It can't be a tautology. So, in order to prove the second group of numbers, you need a third group of numbers. And that group of numbers has the same problem, and that spins out into infinity. And so, this is to me, the deep meaning of Gödel's incompleteness theorems is that any subjective state, any meaningful state, and this is what qualia are, I say in the last episode, that if you were to imagine that consciousness is a jigsaw puzzle, every piece of that jigsaw puzzle is qualia. So the whole thing is consciousness, but every piece of that consciousness is qualia. And what this means is that every piece of your conscious, subjective, meaningful experience is infinite. And if you have a hard time with the idea of infinities with infinities, just look at the work of Cantor, and you will see that you can have infinities with infinities. I mean, you can just think that numbers stretch off into infinity, but also numbers with the number three also stretch off into infinity. Both are infinite, but the total numbers will always be a larger set than those sets that have the number three in it, and you can do that with any combination that you like. So it's established that within infinity, infinity is so large that infinity contains infinities. And it's established through Gödel's incompleteness theorem that no local algorithm, no local set of numbers can hold meaning because those numbers will always rely on a bigger set and more complex set of numbers for their meaning out into infinity. That can be a difficult one to grok. I get that not everybody's going to accept that. But if you accept that qualia is infinite, and it is because if you try to formalize it in the physical world, if you try to instantiate it in a material substance, in order to achieve the goal that you're trying to achieve, that problem stretches out into infinity, and you would have to have an infinite machine. And so, if our consciousness can do what would take an infinite machine to do, it's reasonable then to assert that our consciousness in its nature is infinite. So, grant me that qualia in their at their core, at their substrate, is infinite. Then understand that any choice that we have, and we don't always just have a choice between a binary, you know, left or right, Coke or Pepsi. We, we can make it a binary, but often we have choice among, almost an infinite number of things. You walk through the supermarket and you have choices all around you. But the salient point here is that you don't just have choices over local finite data sets. And I think that, if I'm trying to make the case that I have something new to offer here, it would be to get everybody to reappraise what choices really are. Because, even hardcore determinists like Robert Sapolsky and Sam Harris don't deny the fact of choices. They just basically say that those choices are made by the inherent data in those choices and in what would, you know, appear to be the chooser. And so, me as a local being, me as, having a brain that is a local structure that's, you know, composed of a vast number of atoms and molecules, but is finite nonetheless and is local nonetheless. And I'm looking at a choice such as, do I pick Coca-Cola or do I pick Pepsi? And, that can of Coke and that can of Pepsi are local objects with a finite number of constituent parts, and the data then is finite. And so some mathematical interaction of those two ultimately makes the choice for me. I feel like I'm making the choice. That choice is just illusory. It's just the conservation of momentum moving from moment to moment to moment in, a perfect expression of math dating back to the beginning. But these are local and they're finite. But when we're making choices, we're not making choices between exterior, local, objective realities so much as we're making choices between subjective qualia. And if our choices are truly choices between qualia, right? Coke and Pepsi are very similar in a chemical structure. They're both beverages. They will both hydrate. They will both spike my insulin. They will both activate the sweet receptors on my tongue. I'm not saying that any of those local finite characteristics aren't true, but my choice really isn't limited simply to, Pepsi has a little bit more sugar in it. My body just, is programmed to want more sugar, so I always choose Pepsi because that's just not true. Coke's more popular. My choice is between the qualia of Pepsi and the qualia of Coke, right? Think about the difference between the two. They're brands. The hell is a brand? A brand is purely qualia. A brand has history, it has design, it has color. It has an emotional component to it. Maybe, your favorite singer when you were a teenager was drinking Pepsi. I remember Britney Spears, for a while was promoting Pepsi at the Super Bowl halftime, Taste of a New Generation. All of these characteristics are qualia, and they're things that can never be coded into ones and zeros, and they can never be held by local finite data sets because the problem of qualia is the problem of infinity. So I cannot explain at the moment how consciousness uses qualia to push on your body. My consciousness uses qualia to push on my body, but I can establish that it does, right? I'm just switching out one word for another. No, I cannot explain how the consciousness in your body pushes on the material of your body to make a decision. But I believe I can prove that it does. Because when you are making a choice, you are choosing between two qualias, and those qualias are infinite in their ground being. Their substrate is an infinite substrate. It's nothing that could ever be coded into a machine. It is nothing that could ever be formalized. Therefore, it could never be local and it could never be finite. There is a local and finite component to it, which is the actual beverage itself. But the choice as something in your conscious awareness is a qualia that has no end to it. It's a nested infinity. It's an order within a greater order. And so the physical and local, the material and the local, the finite and the local could never handle this problem of Coke and Pepsi because it's a choice between infinite qualias. And so the only thing that could handle that is your consciousness, which is infinite at its ground. And so the thought that I was having yesterday, it was making my coffee, and because I'm in ketosis, what I really want is butter because that'll keep me in ketosis instead of milk, which has sugar in it and will kick me out of ketosis. And I was realizing, right, because I'm trying to imagine, right? Try to catch yourself. How do you make a decision? You don't know how you make a decision. I don't want to speak for you. I don't know how I make a decision. What is this thing that's deciding? But then I realized I'm not really just deciding between this thing called milk and this thing called butter, this local milk and this local butter. I'm choosing between the qualia of both, and that's an infinite task. Therefore, the only thing that can make that choice is the only thing that's infinite within me, which is my consciousness. Indeed, what I would argue is what human beings and all living organisms are is half finite and half infinite. Yes, your body is a finite structure. You only have so many neurons in your brain. You only have so many cells in your body. You only have so many molecules and so many atoms. But the thing that it is host to, which is your consciousness, is infinite. And this is what stands in between something like ChatGPT, giving the illusion of consciousness and actual consciousness. Computers will never rise to actual consciousness because they are finite and local, whereas consciousness in its true ground is infinite and non-local. And since choices are between qualias, which are nested infinity, which are infinite but a lower order of infinite, consciousness is the greater infinity. Qualia are lower orders of infinity within that same infinity. It is only the infinite that could handle making that choice. That choice could never be made by the local and the finite. That's not to say that the local and the finite might make the vast majority of what appear to be decisions for us. And that's something that I talk about in yesterday's um, episode, which has to do with the thought experiment that, among other things, I think just establishes that any iota of free will is free will. The very barest minimum of free will, the smallest, the ability to toggle between the smallest binary possible is free will. And that ability to toggle between any binary, no matter how small, is sufficient to be a substrate for all language. So we don't have to worry about the finite and the local appearing to make decisions for us. That may happen. The wind blows on my body, it blows hard enough, and I'm redirected in a way I don't want to go. We could say the wind made it, blows on my right side, knocks me to the left. The wind decided to move me that way. Right. We can have that. Sure, fine, whatever. But every choice that you make, at least at a conscious level, play around with this. There's an inherent quality to that. There's a qualia. Spend some time with the phenomenon of qualia, the problem of qualia, what it's like to. And it's what it's like to that we're choosing between, right? What it's like to have milk in my coffee, what it's like to have butter in my coffee. Those are infinite in their nature. And so choosing between two possibilities that are infinite in their nature is only something that a greater infinity could do. So what I've established is not how consciousness pushes on matter. I have to take that back. But what I've established is that consciousness pushes on matter. And if we've established that consciousness pushes on matter, then we have established free will.